From Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Today on the show, the shine is fading on Michigan's EV dream.
With layoffs at Bosch and Ford's canceled projects, what's next for the region's auto workers?
And what does it all mean for Michigan's economy?
Also, Detroit and Windsor's creative scenes are finally on the same page.
The zine Pagination is publishing local talent from both sides of the river.
And John Conyers Jr. marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and into history. His son now tells the story of America's longest-serving black congressman.
But first, there's a mayoral election coming up in Detroit. But we know that despite being registered, a lot of city residents won't help make that decision of who the next mayor will be. In this election and in all our elections in this country, we consent to be governed. We decide who gets power, and often they have power over us. But the decision to sit out the vote leaves us with a big question. Why? Why do people give up their vote? Why do they relinquish control over at least some of their destiny? Registered voters not casting a vote is a problem in the city, one that seems to be bigger here than in other Midwest cities. In Columbus, Ohio's Franklin County, the 2024 presidential election turnout was 66%. In Milwaukee, it was 85%. In Chicago, it was about 68%, and that's the lowest it's been in 80 years. But in Detroit, during the same election year, it was 47%. Why? What can be done to change this? And what are the issues that are impacting Detroiters? And are those issues preventing residents from voting? To discuss all this, we have Mada Ostfeld here. She is the research director at the Center for Racial Justice and a professor at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. She's studied why some Detroit residents don't vote and how to increase voter turnout. Professor Ostfeld, welcome to the Metro.
It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's get into it, Professor Ostfeld. In April of last year, you did a survey on Detroiters to understand voting patterns. To the best of your knowledge, why don't many Detroiters vote?
Yeah, I'm really grateful that you're covering this and bringing attention to it. And I just want to be clear, we asked Detroiters last year, so that was leading up to the general election. So there's far more Detroiters who are going to sit out this election because it's a local election, it's off year, it doesn't get the media buzz that the general election does. But when we asked them, by far the most commonly mentioned reason that Detroiters said that they explicitly said they did not plan to vote was because of general distrust in the political system or a sense that their vote doesn't matter. So I think it's important to emphasize that when they said distrust in the system, this is different from distrust in the candidates, but saying, I believe politics is a sham, I'm disappointed in the system, there's too many lies. And that can often be tied to the fact that, especially on larger campaigns, there's so much emphasis on negative campaigning. That tends to be a more effective tool to change the composition of the electorate, but it can also be really powerful in just increasing the sense of disillusionment with the political system and the desire to sit out because it just all seems so bad.
Wow. Can you say more about that, about negative campaigning? Because I feel like that has become such the norm when we look at campaigning overall and how candidates are getting messages out there. But it seems like it's more on a national level than a local one.
It absolutely is. And it is a really sad product of our political system. But unfortunately, it works. When you do a positive campaign, it's just so easy to try to attack that person, kind of to make them seem less credible or their promises seem less credible. And doing so, when you attack someone, that can be really effective at decreasing their base of support. It's much harder to bring someone in and to increase your base of support. And because of that, people just invest more into attacking the other than selling what they're going to do.
So that's the heavy lift, is staying positive and really uplifting the good that you want to do versus taking someone else down, a candidate down. Now, were you surprised at all by these comments? That is, as someone who does this kind of research, is it typically what you see of people who don't vote in elections, this kind of distrust in the system?
I think by far that's the most common reason. Distrust in the system. I don't think my vote matters. I don't think it's going to change anything. Just broad sense that I don't have a lobbyist, so no one's going to listen to me. And there's truth to that. You know, politicians by and large do allocate more resources in terms of time, funding, what they often call pork, to places that tend to donate more and contribute more. But I think you pointed out something important, that that's not always true to the same degree on the local level. And I think it's been really nice to see in some of the local debates that there hasn't been that same emphasis on attacking the other. I think that brings up this other challenge in getting people to vote, is that sometimes it becomes really hard to tell the differences between candidates. And so that leads to this other challenge that, especially on low salience elections, there's just not a lot of information out there. So yes, there is some information about the mayoral candidates, but when you get to city council candidates or school board candidates, it becomes really hard to tell what's the difference between candidate A and B. They're all saying they're going to do good things. So how do I know who to pick?
That's fair. And time is a luxury. I mean, I think about friends that I have who will text me when it gets closer to election day, and they'll say, give me a cheat sheet. Tell me who to vote for, because they know that I'm steeped in this, the political happenings. For a lot of folks, they may not have the time to really study these candidates. I'm wondering if you think some of the folks who have that distrust in the system or have a hard time discerning different candidates from the other, whether it's because of time or another reason, can these people, are they persuadable? Are these folks that can change their minds about voting and see that their vote can make a difference? Has that been your experience in your research?
It is really hard. The most effective thing is person-to-person contact, is one-on-one contact. Like mailers do, yes, you can find like tiny shifts with mailers or radio ads or television ads, but the most effective thing is one-to-one contact. And that kind of makes sense when you're saying, I don't trust the political system. Part of what you're saying is, I don't feel heard. I don't think anything's being changed in response to my concerns. So if we can start to address the first step of that, and just making sure people feel heard and that their concerns are being listened to and kind of validated back to them, then that can be, go part of the way. But people do need to see some of these changes take place. When they say they're concerned about X, they do need to see X being addressed for that to be seen as worth it for them to come out and vote.
Whose job is that? Who do you think? Is it the politicians who should be doing that?
I mean, I think that's a good question. And unfortunately, no one person is on the line for it. And so no single person really suffers the cost. But it is the job of our entire system. If we want to call ourselves democracy and people don't feel like they can trust the system, they don't want to turn out, I don't know if you could call that a democracy anymore. So I do think it's something that I'm interested. I know a lot of people share that passion for trying to engage voters one-on-one, organize them, make sure, invest into neighborhood block groups, community associations, so people feel heard and feel that they have the power to shape outcomes.
Can you talk more about the folks who are not voting in Detroit? Are they younger or older? Are they disproportionately poorer?
The big differences that we see is that three groups really jumped out to us. Yes, younger voters are less likely to vote. Lower education voters, those without a formal 4-year college degree, and Latino voters. And something that there's threads that tie these groups together, and there's some distinct components. Latinos are by far the most group who say they are eligible to vote, but are not turning out to vote. And part of that is because when you have a lot of members of your group who are first or second generation, think about it. When you go to another country, do you immediately know the political divides or the meaning of the different parties? It takes time to learn that. And part of voting is something that you transmit from one generation to the other. So if your parents were still figuring out the political system and didn't vote, then you're less likely to vote. And that also is part of the reason younger voters, voting is a culture. Voting is a behavior. It's something you pick up over time. So if you haven't voted before, it takes time for you to pick up that behavior. But that's also why the earlier we teach people to vote, the more likely that we know evidence has shown, the more likely they are to vote in every election down the road.
Yeah, I could imagine it feeling really foreign, the whole idea of voting, if, say, you didn't grow up in a household where you had parents or other people who were influencing you saying, like, today's the day to go and vote.
Right. Let's go out. Let's make a plan. When are you planning to go? Have you read about this candidate? Have you figured this stuff out? Exactly.
Let's stay on the topic of race for a moment, if we could, because that plays a big role in this country and this country's politics. And Detroit is a majority Black city. So I'm wondering how race is showing up in conversations about why residents don't vote beyond the Latino vote when we're thinking about Black residents as well.
Something that really stood out to us is when we asked unlikely voters or people who reported, and we know far more people won't vote, but people who explicitly said, I'm not likely to vote. When we asked them about the most important issues, some of the things that we saw really emphasized kind of the conflicts that they're facing. So, for example, you see a lot of unlikely voters, most of whom are Black because we live in an 80% Black city. Crime and safety is a concern. At the same time, policing is a concern. And so when you feel like you have this issue and no civic institution that you fully trust to address it, that really, disincentivizes action or engagement on multiple levels. You really don't feel like, you're being heard or respected in a lot of levels. And there's like a psychological toll and a cultural toll to feeling unsafe in your own community for any number of reasons.
So in other words, the distrust that people have of the political system is stemming from feeling like they're shut out because the system has historically wronged a lot of people of color, specifically Black folks.
Yeah. And you can see that. I mean, I think the crime and safety is like one policy example of that. But obviously you could go to the issues of redlining and housing affordability and the fact that, tons of people have family that bought their home and earned their home and, they inherited it and now they're behind on property taxes or they didn't get all the paperwork and now they're facing all these costs. And that's also a byproduct of the racism that's been embedded in our system. So you see this issue really transcend policy issues, this matter of institutionalized discrimination and really heighten a sense of distrust in the civic organizations that are supposed to serve us.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Ahead of Detroit's mayoral election, we're talking about why voting rates are low in this city compared with other Midwestern cities. We're speaking with University of Michigan professor Mata Ostfeld, who researches this issue and the biggest issues that Detroiters say they're facing. Now, Professor Ostfeld, something I think we have been alluding to a little bit here is the fact that poverty is playing a role as well. A lot of folks in general don't have the resources they need in the city of Detroit. Talk about how much poverty gets in the way of folks voting and the barriers that we may not think about when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think when we think about poverty, I think the biggest barrier it presents is a tax on time and resources and just the psychological toll it takes. You just don't have time to figure out the difference between these candidates. I think mail-in voting has helped to mitigate that and so we've dropped some barriers, and that's great. A lot of people I was interested because I feel like the state and the city has done a lot to promote mail-in voting, but a lot of people were still unfamiliar with that as an option and how to set oneself up, and the fact that you have to change where you're registered every time you move. So that was one thing, but I think the bigger barrier is just understanding what's at stake and the differences between the options you're presented. And as we know, that just takes time and an investment that is harder to come by if you're living in poverty.
I'm also thinking about the fact that more than 30% of residents don't have a reliable vehicle in the city of Detroit. And that has me wondering about how much geography matters. That is, if people live in denser, more walkable neighborhoods, does that make them any more likely to vote because they live close to a polling location that, let's say, they could walk to?
There has been some evidence of that. I'm not as familiar with that, but I will say that when we've done our surveys, we have seen people report that their polling place had changed and they didn't know it had changed and they didn't know where it had changed to. And that's hard because I get that sometimes it changes for good reasons to make a more appropriate space. But it's just getting access to that information when you're, dealing with so many things. It can be hard to manage all the information that comes from various sources about elections and sift through it to determine what's accurate, what's not, and what you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, again, that information feels like a luxury. Now, there are things that we could do federally to get people to vote, things like making voting days holidays or paying people to vote. The state of Michigan has made it easier to vote by allowing more people to vote absentee, as we've been discussing, or to receive a ballot in the mail. What can cities do to increase voter turnout?
I mean, I think there's no quick fixes. I think we all want to think that there's especially in academia, we want to think that there's something we can send or something we can do. But earning back trust is not a quick fix. It's something that has to, candidates and the government really has to invest back into earning the trust of local residents and saying not only it's worth it to communicate with your elected officials, but this is why. This is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to follow through, and you can contact me. I think there just has to be a massive time investment on the city, and I know resources are limited for everyone, but into re-earning that trust.
It sounds like that means you really couldn't put a price tag on the value of local leaders interfacing with their constituents more, holding more of those town halls, being able to draw a direct line and say, I enacted this policy and here is what it is going to do for you, type of thing.
Yeah. Following through. And it's like the little things when we look at some of the most important issues that Detroiters want to see their government address, it's potholes. Potholes continue to come back up. The really hyper local things. People will mention that greenhouse on my corner that has been blighted forever. I want to see, and people will come up to us when we've done door-to-door surveys and say, I hear you. The only thing I want you to record is that greenhouse needs to be fixed. And so it's that very hyper local attention that when people don't feel like that's been addressed year after year, then they're like, what's the point? How are you going to address big things if you can't address this one pothole or speed bump or, blighted house in my neighborhood?
Very emblematic of just how hyper local politics really is. Before we move to the issues that are most persistent for Detroit residents, I want to ask about the people who do vote. What do you know about the folks who are most likely to cast ballots?
I mean, countering the other point, these are Detroiters who tend to be older, have more time and resources, often have had, more time to develop a history and generate experience, more education. And both Black and white voters seem to be voting at equal rates. There's still a lot of room for improvement in increasing that rate, but those are the groups that we see most represented at our polls right now.
Now, you've done surveys on the issues that Detroiters say are most important to resolve. And I think you just mentioned what one of them is actually when we were talking about blight. But tell us more about what they say the problems are.
Yeah, and these are always tricky. Questions to address because often, in past many surveys, we'll ask closed-ended items, but then you're limiting the number of options that respondents, that Detroiters can share. So we went down this road of just asking people in their own words to say what they wanted the city to address. And we tried to categorize it in the way that we felt most best represented their views. The thing that really jumped out far and away is concerns about crime and safety. And that's a really tricky thing to discuss. Yeah. It's a sensitive issue, but also it was a very salient issue at the time. All of the candidates were talking about it. We know when people talk about the most important issues, it's very deeply affected by whatever's constantly in the news. We know local news tends to cover crime a lot, and we know the candidates were talking about it. So that was a big part of that. The other issues we broke down, but those could just as easily be grouped together. The next three issues were road repairs, like potholes, and neighborhood maintenance, examples being like sidewalk repairs. A lot of people mentioned lighting. Dumping was a huge concern, fixing trees. And then the next one was structural blight. And those three could just as easily be grouped together to compose a category of neighborhood infrastructure that would rival and exceed the concerns about crime and safety. But those are consistently the top concerns that we see Detroiters mention when we ask about local issues that they want to see the city address.
Professor Ostfeld, and the last time you asked these questions, remind me when that was?
This was last done in 2024, but we just did another, and that was done with Outlier Media. We just did another survey about the challenges Detroiters are facing, which is a little different. You might say this is a challenge, but maybe it's not in the purview of the city government to address. But this does really map on to what we saw Detroiters saying are their biggest challenges. Again, concerns about safety, and then concerns about neighborhood infrastructure with dumping, illegal dumping, often by people coming in from outside the city being a huge concern, road repairs, lighting. People really want to see better lighting in their neighborhoods.
I'm wondering if any of these issues have prevented people from voting. For example, is safety or road repairs getting in the way of people casting a vote?
That's a really interesting issue. There's people studying. There's a PhD student right now, Brenda Romero, who's looked at how the psychological toll of concerns about crime and how that can be a deterrent effect on political engagement. We're looking at how the city's interventions and community violence initiatives may be reducing that harmful effect and mitigating it. And so hopefully we can see turnout increase from when those CVIs were implemented to afterwards. But there's certainly a toll when you're just overwhelmed by the day-to-day experiences and challenges that are around you that are on a very, kind of in-your-face scale. It becomes harder to think about these macro issues that of course are related, but start to feel like a luxury to engage with.
I want to close things out by going back to something you mentioned, because I realize when it comes to solutions that this feels hard. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned earlier the notion of us reaching out to folks maybe who don't vote, right? Like maybe that's within your life or within an adjacent circle. So how much value do you put on that, on just, let's say for me, someone who votes, just trying to spend a little time with some non-voting friends, family, neighbors, and making the case for that? How much value do you assign to that?
That is by far and away the thing that we found to be most effective. In the past, we've done experiments in Detroit neighborhoods where we had one, in this case, it was a local resident just highlight on their social media that they were planning to vote, and this was the plan. And we looked at validated turnout among people in their network that they had contacted, both through their kind of social media posts and then one-on-one say, hey, I'm voting. Are you planning to vote too? That was by far the biggest effect on turnout, especially youth turnout. So don't underestimate the power of just saying, hey, I'm highlighting that you're planning to vote, highlighting your interest, because that just does change the norms that people see around civic engagement.
Wow. So that social media post where you say, I'm voting today, can help to strengthen democracy.
Absolutely.
Mara Ostfeld is the research director at the Center for Racial Justice and a professor at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Professor Ostfeld, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thanks for letting me be here.
Detroit's primary election is August 5th. City Council and Board of Police Commissioner candidates are on the ballot. The general election for Detroit's next mayor is November 4th. WDET has officially lost all federal funding. This is something we've been talking about this week on this program. It amounts to hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. These cuts are a big hit to WDET. Now, the station isn't going anywhere, but locally produced programs like the Metro are at risk. There is something you can do, though. WDET is looking to add 1,000 new members. Join Team DET and the fight to protect local news, to protect democracy, and Detroit-made public radio. Go to WDET.org/give. We'll be right back on the Metro. Stay with us.